Are you looking for something with a gothic edge that is disturbing and more than a little haunted, in the vein of Shirley Jackson's We Have Always Lived in the Castle, or Sarah Gailey's Just Like Home, or Sue Rainsford's Follow Me to Ground? Do I have the book for you, with Woodworm by Layla Martínez, translated by Sophie Hughes and Annie McDermott, because as the book itself says, and we've been here ever since, and here we'll stay till we rot, and for a long time after that. Around this time last year, we were taking a romance break, but as we've been in Bridgerton mode for a couple of months, do not worry, we are not abandoning romance altogether. Absolutely not. However, I needed a break for something that was a little odd and disturbing and kind of living in that gothic atmosphere. And the blurb of this book, or the back of this book, kind of perfectly encapsulates this kind of weird atmospheric tale with "The house breathes. The house holds bodies and secrets. The house is visited by ghosts, by angels that line the roof like insects, and by saints that burn the bedsheets with their halos." This is a story following a granddaughter and a grandmother who are trapped by, no surprise, intergenerational trauma that has manifested, and how this house is holding them captive, but how they are more complicated narrators than they first appear, in a really tight kind of format here. So hello, if you are new or somewhat new, my name is Melody, and on this channel we talk about books. Ideally, almost every Friday we talk about a specific title or dive specifically into a title. I know I have been a little bit bad at that lately, with a new job, with Bridgerton, with just lots of things going on, so I'm really hoping to get back in the swing of that. But if you like to talk about books from all angles, I would love to have you hang out here. Go ahead and subscribe, like, comment, interact. It all helps. I know you know the drill, and you can do everything at your own discretion. Obviously, you have free will. Now, back to what's actually important, this book. Now, if you did not know, it does indeed have, I'm going to try and get the contrast right here, a blurb from Mariana Enriquez on the cover. I adore Mariana Enriquez, and of course that was worth throwing off the white balance for. But if you've been here for a second, you know that. If you haven't been here for a second, welcome, and now you know that. And so this is actually the second Mariana Enriquez blurbed title I've read this year, and I don't want this blurb to overshadow my analysis of the book. However, I do think that it is interesting in talking about what you expect from a book based on who's blurbing it, because I am drawn to Mariana Enriquez for her dark kind of thematic explorations, for her oddness, for the danger that kind of permeates her narrative, whether in her short stories or in her much longer novel. And I think all of that is really evident in this book, and it's a great example of where a blurb really works, especially when I, as a reader, have a strong connection with an author, and that tells me what I'm getting into with this text. And it absolutely delivers on that promise, because the voice in this is delicious and disturbing. Now, I will say this is definitely a narrative, a novella technically, at 150 pages, for readers who are interested in voice, in atmosphere, and kind of thematic explorations in those pictures that are being drawn. And the blurb from Mariana Enriquez mentions poetry and revenge, and I think poetry is important because it really is exploring the way language is crafted here, because as you can see, or maybe probably not based on contrast, but I have actually flagged a number of passages here, and it all goes back to the language. And often that language I've flagged is kind of scratching at those thematic explorations, but the language itself is just delicious. Like I said before, there was the passage I read earlier, there was this passage, I mean, I could pick any of them, but all families keep their dead under the mattress. My mother used to tell me, it's just that we can see ours. So there we have those hints of how that intergenerational trauma is manifesting in this house. Or who's to say why we see what we see, she said, or why some shadows are just a wheezing sound around a corner and others are furious vermin. Why sometimes they appear as the faintest of shivers and other times they burrow deep in our guts. And I will say, this use of language, the specificity of language, is also, I would argue, a testament to the translation. So I recognize that it is a team effort here, but the specificity of language that kind of goes out into the specificity of the entire narrative is just really impressive here. And it goes to the title of the thing, which is Woodworm. And you get the kind of sense of what that is just from looking at it. I am not a contractor. I don't deal with houses on the regular. So I did look up the definition just to be working from kind of the baseline for it, because I recognize how important it is, especially when this idea of this house and how this house is trapping the women of this family and holding them captive is operating. And so we're all kind of working off of the same definition here. Woodworm, the damaged condition of wood resulting from infestation with this larva. So it is, you know, a bug that has infested, but we definitely are dealing with the damaged condition of this home, of this family structure, of these relationships, as well as this idea of infestation. We see this within the book itself, with the house feeling infested by spirits, by saints, by angels who are described as insect-like in a way that is really kind of creepy, right? And so it sets this atmosphere where everything is kind of unsettling, but the run-down kind of infested condition of this home is also representative of these characters and their interior lives. So everything is obviously metaphor here as well, in a very real way, but in a way where those manifestations are interacted with. And so it's not simply a matter of, is this a figment of our narrator's imaginations, which it absolutely still could be, but it is something that is very actual and tangible within the narrative itself. And I really like that oddness in my fiction, where even if it's metaphor, even if it is representative, and there is that question in my mind as a reader that the author is placing there of, is this real or is this a figment? I still like the idea that we are interacting with those things as if they are real, that they are very real and dangerous and tangible to our characters. And it's a way of really visualizing these more conceptual conceits when we're talking about intergenerational trauma, when we're talking about class trauma and the kind of socioeconomic structures and hierarchies that are passed down through generations and what systems keep those in place, and how you're kind of fighting back against a wall in some ways. That is not a great metaphor. That's why I'm not writing the books. But there is a lot going on here in 150 pages, and there's a real specificity to the execution here, and also a real gradual descent. There is a sense of movement within the narrative, even within a very confined and claustrophobic exploration and story. And this is also impressive because we are operating within the confines of a single house, and yet the narrative and the story actually spreads outside of the walls of this house in terms of the context, the history that is circling us back to the current moment. And yet the way it's structured, the fact that this is kind of flashback and these two characters grappling with things, which we will touch on in a second, I promise, in terms of the context there for you and for us to be on the same page. However, the way this is structured also traps us as readers in the house, and that desperation is very tangible. We can feel the claustrophobia there. We can feel that kind of slipping as we accept our fates, in the sense of being trapped in this place, because we are following, even within this very short story, two distinct point of views. We have a granddaughter and a grandmother, and they are never really explicitly named, which is kind of using these characters as a stand-in for the kind of universality of the story, especially because the rich family that they work for are named. And so there is this sense of trying to paint them as everymen, which is incredibly interesting within the context of these women, and the fact that they start to reveal themselves very quickly as unreliable narrators, and the two points of view are kind of in conversation with each other and calling the other out on their perspective, even within this really lush and gorgeous and haunting language. And so we're introduced or brought into the story with the granddaughter coming home, and it becomes evident very quickly that she is coming home from jail, And there is some story there. In this small community, there has been talk around her incarceration, but as readers, we don't know right off the bat why she has been in jail. And so her as a narrator, because we are in her point of view first, is trying to paint this very specific picture for us. But even within that very specific picture, it acknowledges right off the bat that this house is haunted, that there is something wrong right out of the gate. And as an example of this, the first sentence of the book is, "I walked in and the house pounced on me." And so we also have this very active language, even within the personification of the house, where the house is its own entity, and that could be unpacked as a character as well. The language is very active. And so that makes it even more interesting when these women, the granddaughter and the grandmother, are almost kind of trying to distance themselves from the actions within their own lives that have put them in this place, because there is this sense that they are trapped in the home. And there is this kind of family idea of a curse, this idea that you cannot leave this house, which is kind of teased with the knowledge that the granddaughter's mother isn't here and that she has disappeared, and the language used around that disappearance really alludes to an abduction. And so there is this real sense that if you try to escape the bounds too much, this place will suck you back in, and that there is this force at play. And yet, as we untangle these women's lives even more, it complicates this idea of them only as victims, which they unquestionably are, but there are also choices they've made that as a reader I can't fully get on board with, and at the same time we're seeing things from their perspective, and so they are trying to convince us as the reader of their point of view, and not necessarily their innocence, but why certain actions were taken, at the same time that they're kind of complicating the view of the other point of view. So the grandmother is directly calling her granddaughter a liar and complicating what we've seen within that first chapter, even if within that first chapter we already get the sense that there's something deeper going on, that something is not quite right. And then through the grandmother's point of view, we get a little bit more sense of the full history of this family and the idea that things are kind of rotten to the core, but kind of rotten to the core throughout, because the community isn't fully innocent either. And so there are a lot of really complex ideas being explored here, further complicated by the idea that no one in this narrative is perfectly innocent, and this idea of how this kind of corruption seeps into everything, and this is illustrated or personified within the house itself, even if there are these kind of checks and balances even within the house, of this idea of it being both this kind of trap in this prison, but also protective in some ways as well. And there is a lot in this that I can't even begin to unpack. And even as I'm sitting here talking, I'm questioning things about my own analysis. I'm like, did we never get the names? Like, no, we never got the names, at least to my reading. If you've read it recently and you're like, Melody, they're clearly there, correct me if I'm wrong. But it's a lot of this really odd atmospheric, like I said, language that we're kind of languishing in a way where it is very lyrical and it pushes us along, even as there is this haunting to it. And like I said, it's very active and we feel that kind of tension and menace, but it is kind of deceptive in how smoothly it's kind of circling down the drain, and how things kind of spiral and spike in terms of consequence, where we are really watching these two women make a life-altering decision for themselves as well as others, but how it is stemming from this idea of revenge. And so while it's an act that should be and is atrocious, by this point in the narrative, it has kind of lulled us not into a false sense of security, because we never feel, or at least I never felt, fully safe within the narrative, but we kind of have to double back and kind of question what we're seeing and realize the kind of atrocities that are at play here. And to have these kind of really complex women as the drivers of this story that are both victims and villains within different contexts is really interesting and really compelling, because it's looking at the way that this kind of trauma is passed on through the generations and how it can continue in perpetuity. And it's just a really complex, kind of rough look at this, where again, no one is a perfect victim or villain, and there are villainous acts, but they're also kind of painted in a way, especially within the way that the point of view is working, where it's getting us, and I think it aims to get us as a reader kind of off balance and kind of make us question those simplistic ideas of right and wrong, especially when the acts, the more violent acts, especially outside of the kind of context of the granddaughter's great-grandfather, the grandmother's father, that violence feels very real and tangible and not so much kind of symbolic. But there is violence referred to at the end of the book that is really kind of shrouded in metaphor and this idea of what exactly we are dealing with. Now, the way the end plays out leans in one particular direction, but the way that the book is written is open to interpretation, I think, very purposefully. And so it's something that you could definitely argue with a book club in terms of the fallout of the narrative. And I think that those differing perspectives and interpretations are incredibly purposeful, especially when we have, again, this dual point of view that one switches without telling the reader it's switching. So you have to kind of pick up on it within context clues, which are clearly and evidently there, but it's that languidness, again, of moving throughout the narrative. And so again, my brain keeps circling back to the descriptor delicious for this, which doesn't feel right in the sense that this is a really disturbing narrative in a lot of ways. Again, it's supposed to keep you, at least to my analysis, off balance as a reader. It's haunted and haunting. And so delicious feels weird, but the language is just so gorgeous in this. And like I said, I tabbed a lot of it for a reason. Now, I will say in terms of the construction of the book itself, I don't love, and I mentioned this in my indie bookstore video, but I don't love that it is a hardcover, a white hardcover without a dust jacket as a novella. So this is 150 pages. I kind of tore right through it. Based on the language, I could see myself easily revisiting this, especially because there are so many passages that I marked as kind of a place to revisit that language, those thematic ideas, this, that, and the other. However, this is a basically $22 novella, and that just feels unnecessary to me, especially because I don't like the fact, okay, it's technically beige or off-white, and I love the cover, but this is gonna get dirty. I had to read it with a napkin around it because I was afraid of getting it dirty, which I know sounds ridiculous and is an extreme act. Extreme may be an extreme assessment, but still. And even with these beautiful end papers, I don't think it needs to be $22. You can still give us these beautiful end papers in a paperback with French flaps even, as I suggested earlier. I am just realizing that this title page has carcoma, which I, one, apologize for the pronunciation of, but two, believe is the Spanish title. Let me just double check. Yes, it is the Spanish, which also brings up that woodworm could just be the poetic name for termite. And so the idea of the kind of crumbling foundation, and the crumbling foundation is definitely being explored here. And it is a trip that you kind of just have to go on yourself as a reader. Again, if you like that really poetic, atmospheric, gothic, haunted atmosphere, I think this is going to be right up your alley. And it is a short, digestible read on top of that, even with the kind of overarching thematic explorations that I can't fully unpack here, because you kind of have to go on the ride of the narrative and let the language kind of wash over you. Even then, I think it is still a really accessible title in that you can just kind of sit down and read the whole thing in an evening, in a weekend, whatever time you have. I also noted, as the cicadas are screaming at me currently, which Chicago is actually late to the cicada brood party, and I don't know if these are just the normal cicadas or the broods. However, I did note in my reading journal that when I was reading this was the first night I registered the cicadas outside again, and they're screaming, which felt very fitting for this book, again, because of that insect imagery, especially in relation to the angels. And we see it with the angels, I think, more than the saints, and presenting them as these kind of insect-like creatures I found really interesting as well. And so the imagery that kind of permeates throughout, the visual images, there are a lot of really striking visual images packed into this little book, whether it be the visualization of those angels, whether it be some things I would love to talk more about, but technically are spoilers, because it's kind of, you just have to kind of lay out the central conceit. A girl is coming home after being in jail in this house that has kind of trapped generations of women of her family, and will they be able to escape this essentially curse? So you can kind of see where the Shirley Jackson comes into play there, especially though we have always lived in the castle, though it has been a second since I've read that. So if you have read any of the books I mentioned earlier and enjoyed them, I definitely think that you should give this a go. If you like Mariana Enriquez and that blurb means something to you, I definitely think this delivers. Also, if you haven't read Thirst yet this year, another one you should pick up. But there is a lot of discussion that could be had with this book, and if you have things to say, I would love to hear your thoughts below. Overall, a really unsettling but ultimately enjoyable read. I really, really loved this, and as you may know, I've been kind of in a mini slump. I'm saying mini because it makes me feel better, but for me, it's basically a slump. And so this kind of helped pull me back with a book that is very focused. And again, I mentioned this in my indie bookstore day video, and I meant to discuss it earlier again here, but this idea that this book is short and specific, but still covers so much ground and territory while also having movement to the story. I have read a number of books recently that are falling in that like 300-page range, whether a little under, a little over, that have ultimately left me a little disappointed because they're not really getting all the way to where I think they're trying to get. And I was starting to question myself, like, is it because I'm picking up shorter books? But no, the book should be the length of the story that needs to be told. And there's something to be said on the other side about bloated narratives too. But it was just a nice reminder that it is possible to execute, which again, I know, but that I've just been having some bad luck recently in my own reading life. Again, nothing that's like atrocious, it's just not to the full potential that I think is there. However, this I do think is to the full potential that is there, and I was incredibly pleased and more than a little unsettled by this, but at the same time was almost like cheering on the language. Like every time I got to a really stellar sentence, I got incredibly excited and just like felt almost giddy. So if you need some language that makes you feel almost giddy while also being kind of disturbing, like I said, this is your book. But let me know what you're thinking, whether you too are drawn to this kind of narrative or whether it's maybe not your cup of tea. But either way, thank you so much for hanging out and listening to what I have to say. Again, like and subscribe if you feel like it. Read something good, and yeah, bye.